Hello YouTube and welcome back to the channel. This is part 2 of the H&R Sport Spring install, and we're going to be working on the front suspension this time around. Before we get started, get the right tools for the job. A ball joint separator and a spring compressor will both make this job a lot easier and safer, and you can rent these tools from your nearest auto parts store. Alright, let's get to it. We'll start off by removing this 17mm nut from the tie rods. You can now try to separate the tie rod from the strut assembly. And remember when I said get the right tools for the job? Well, you should really use a ball joint separator here. I did manage to separate the tie rod using the pickle fork, but I also managed to sort of destroy the ball joint boot and waste a lot of energy in the process. Right on the other side of the strut assembly, you can remove the 19mm nut that attaches to the control arm. Next, you need to detach the sway bar link from the control arm. Here's one way of doing it. In hindsight, there is a nut right underneath the control arm that makes it easier, and I actually did it that way when I did the other side. You will also need to remove the brake caliper from the rotors. You'll notice here I took the brake caliper apart. That was just me not paying attention, and all you really need to do is take out the two 19mm bolts from the back of the caliper to take everything out in a single piece. Once you get the caliper off the rotor, you can use a zip tie to hang it from the car. Just be careful not to damage the brake line that's attached to it. You can also put something right underneath it, as long as you don't stretch that brake line. I then proceeded to detach the control arm from the strut assembly, and here's when I realized I was definitely using the wrong tool. So I went to my local AutoZone and rented this ball joint separator. Make sure you pick up the right socket for the tool while you're at it. In this case, this was a 24mm socket. And it's always fun and a good scare when it finally snaps. Wait for it. So here's a very important tip when using the ball joint separator. Loosen the nut, but don't take it all the way off. Just leave it on to where it levels off with the top of the threads, so that when you push down with the tool, you don't damage the threads. Ask me how I know. You can now move to the engine bay and remove the three 13mm nuts that hold the strut mount to the strut tower. Just make sure you have something supporting the strut assembly before you do this. In my case, I used the floor jack. You can now remove the entire strut assembly from the car and go someplace comfortable to work on the spring. Here is where you will need the spring compressor to remove the spring safely. With the spring compressed and the tension now removed from the strut mount, you can attempt to remove the strut nut to take everything apart. Now the top 19mm nut will certainly spin with the shock shaft as you try to remove it. So after searching the internet for options, It was evident that using an impact wrench was really the way to go here. I had been looking for an excuse to add an impact wrench to my tool set, so I took this opportunity to go out and get one. Here's a side-by-side shot of the Tokiko Springs and the new H&R Sports. I also got new spring pads for the fronts. These are about $3 a piece, so it makes sense to replace them while you're at it. So here's the other step where you will definitely need the spring compressor, as there is no other way to put this back together without one. To tighten the top nut back on, I started with my ratchet while I still had the assembly out of the car, and I finished it off once it was installed under pressure with my impact wrench. To mount the strut assembly back on the car, I was lucky enough to have a friendly neighbor give me a hand and actually guide it from the top. But you can also do this on your own with the help of a floor jack, which I had to do on the other side of the car. The rest of the install is essentially the reverse of the disassembly. I used a flathead screwdriver to help me put the ball joint boot back on correctly. You will need to put some pressure under the ball joints to put the nuts back on, so I use the floor jack in this case. It is also worth mentioning that all of these are self-locking nuts, and it is recommended you install new ones once you remove the old ones. I didn't have them available to me at this time, but I do plan on going back and replacing these in the tie rods and the control arm whenever I get a chance. You can then install the calipers back on the rotors using the two 19mm bolts on the back. With the brake calipers installed, you can now mount the wheels back on, lower the car, and get back to the engine bay. With the weight of the car on the strut assembly, we can now torque down the strut mount nuts. For the last step, you need to tighten the 19mm top nut. And that'll do it for the front springs. Here's some before and after shots of the rears and the fronts and how the car looked like in the end. So you can see here I used the impact wrench to tighten the strut nut back on. This is not recommended as you have no control of the torque you're applying and you can damage the shaft. This is actually spelled out in the manufacturer's guidelines. This special socket is what you should be using instead. In my case, I didn't really have a choice as whoever worked on this car last had apparently already damaged the shaft. You can see that on this picture. The top was essentially cut off. The car drove fine for several miles and then all of a sudden I started hearing this clunking noise when steering. I took everything apart and this is what I found. As you can see, the threads are pretty much gone and now I have to replace both front chucks to get it fixed. This means I'm gonna have to take everything apart for the third time, so I might as well do a bit of a suspension refresh front and back. So watch out for another video where I'll be installing new shocks, outer ball joints, upper strut mounts, tie rods, and everything else that I can get my hands on while I'm there. See you next time.